Suffering is not the last word. Joy comes in the morning.
This is a righteous cause, and I have always believed that unearned suffering is redemptive.
Be no more crying, be no more sickness, be no more death, but you're going to find joy, eternal joy. Joy to the world, the Lord has come. The depths of that has no end. The joy of that has no end.
Suffering is what we're called to in this life, and we're more like Jesus when we are suffering. Well, peace, friends. I'm Pastor Tom Arthur from Sycamore Creek Church, and today we're talking about a paradox. What exactly is a paradox? Well, here's a definition of a paradox. A seemingly absurd or self-contradictory statement or proposition that, when investigated or explained, may prove to be well-founded or true. Or as John Perkins says, a paradox is when you get what you don't expect. You don't expect to find joy when you're suffering. Our goal throughout this 3-week series is to explore the paradox of joy and suffering. And it's a paradox that you showed up for a series called Count It All Joy that's about suffering. This series is based on a book by the same name that is written by John Perkins. And we're going to take some time together to watch a John Perkins documentary coming up after one of our worship services at each of our campus. But let me give you just a little, background to who John Perkins is. John Perkins is in his 90s, which means he's lived through a lot of different things in this world. He was born into poverty under the Jim Crow South. He eventually grew and had children. He lost 2 of those children. He was beaten unjustly by sheriffs. He has gone through cancer along with his wife going through cancer. He started the Christian Community Development Association, or the CCDA. This guy is, kind of a modern day saint. And while you may not agree with everything in his book, I certainly don't, he is worth listening to, particularly when it comes to the question of suffering. I've learned that true joy is formed in the crucible of suffering, and I want to share that joy that I've found. None of us want suffering, but when it comes as a teacher. There's not a lot of people who could say that when suffering comes, it comes as a teacher, and that I would listen to them. But John Perkins is one of them. Only God can put suffering together with joy and make it make sense. So throughout this 3-week series, we've been looking at, the paradox of joy and suffering. Last week, we looked at when suffering chooses you. That is like, it came upon you. You didn't have any choice in the matter. And next week, we're going to get to, joy in the morning. When I don't know whether suffering leaves, but there's joy on the other side of this. But today, we're going to take a look at the paradox of when you choose suffering. You heard me right. When you choose suffering. As John Perkins says, suffering is what we are called to in this life. We are more like Jesus when we suffer. Suffering is what we are called to in this life. We are more like Jesus. Oh my gosh, that punches me in the gut, friends. So, we're going to unpack what that all means. But first, let's take a minute and stop and let's chat. Turn to your neighbor or put your answer into the comments for this question. What do you think of the idea that we are called to suffer? Let's talk about that. This idea that we're called to suffering is probably new to many of you. So we're going to talk about 3 different places where we are called to suffer, all right? So if you're sort of freaking out, like you're like, Tom just punched me in the gut, hang with me, okay? I think this is going to make sense. Here is the first place where we are called to suffer. We are called to suffer for the sake of the gospel. In 107 AD, one of the early church leaders, his name was Ignatius of Antioch, was condemned by Rome to death. And so he was, taken from Antioch to Rome. And along the way, he wrote 7 letters to churches that were in different cities that went by where, the Roman authorities were taking him. Does this sound familiar? I mean, this is kind of like the MO for Christians in the day. He's just living into what they did. They wrote letters back and forth to each other. And what's surprising about his letters to these 7 different churches is he tells them to resist the urge to try to fight his execution. Resist the urge to keep him from essentially becoming a martyr. And so when you see pictures of Ignatius of Antioch, you always see that there are lions in the frame, and they're usually chewing on him in some very morbid way because he was persecuted and killed by throwing him to the wild beasts for the entertainment of Rome. Now, if this whole thing is hard for you to understand or even comprehend or imagine, maybe it would be helpful to think of Ignatius of Antioch the way that artificial intelligence does. Here's an AI rendering of Ignatius of Antioch, which makes him look like a D&D character. Here's what Ignatius said in one of those letters to one of those churches. I am the wheat of God, and I am ground by the teeth of wild beasts, that I may be found the pure bread of God. When I suffer, I shall be the freed man of Jesus Christ, and shall rise again free in him. Ignatius saw it as a goal or a great spiritual practice to submit himself to martyrdom, to suffer for the sake of the good news of Jesus. Now, thankfully, most of us are not faced with the choice to, claim our Christianity or die. But it may still be tempting to think that this was something that happened only in ancient times back in the 2nd century, but it still happens today. In 2015 in Libya, ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq, they kidnapped 21 Christians in Libya, and they were construction workers that were working in Libya. And they videotaped them, marching them down to the beach, and they gave each one of them the chance to recant their faith or to be executed. And all 21 of them chose to essentially be executed. 20 of them were from Egypt. One was an African Christian from Ghana. And then ISIS posted this video online. This act, of course, was denounced by the government authorities of both Egypt and Libya. It was denounced by the Coptic Church, which is essentially the Christian church in Egypt. But maybe most importantly, it was denounced by Islamic religious leaders in the region. This was a fringe group of Islam, a fringe group of Muslims, not the majority of Muslims. These 21 Christians have now been recognized officially as martyrs by the Coptic Church, that is the Egyptian Christian church, but also the Roman Catholic Church, as 21 people who suffered for the sake of the gospel. Thankfully, probably none of us are ever going to face this sort of persecution or this sort of pressure to suffer in this way. And our suffering in our day and age is maybe going to come more from pressures of, is our Christianity or our place in Christianity irrelevant? Or are we embarrassed about being Christians or about what other Christians are doing? I think these are the kind of sufferings that most of us are going to experience for the sake of the gospel today. You may wonder, Tom, what are you talking about suffering out of irrelevance? Well, let me tell you a story. I do hospital visits from time to time. I'm not the main person who does that. Our pastor, care pastor, Tom Fox, does them. But I am down at Sparrow from time to time. If you've ever been in Sparrow, you know that there is a Starbucks in the lobby of Sparrow. And so I had my clergy badge on, and that clergy badge cuts through a lot of red tape in the hospital system. And I'm basically treated as an employee of the hospital, even though I'm not. Well, I walk up to Starbucks and the barista looks at my badge and he says, "What's a clergy?" It's clergy. And a clergy is, well, it's basically a pastor. I didn't like give him that much attitude like I'm giving you right now. But I felt it inside. I'm like, are we so irrelevant to what's going on? I mean, this was of course a young barista. I don't know what you're imagining that person looks like, but it's probably not what you're imagining in your head. But there was a sort of like irrelevance, a suffering of irrelevance that I experienced in that moment. And actually, I've adopted that word or that pronunciation of clergy as clergy for the once a month get-togethers that I do with my colleagues. For once a month we get together and we go out to a pub and we have drinks, and I call it clergy night out, just to remind me of my irrelevance to the barista at Starbucks and probably most millennials and Gen Zers. So we may experience the suffering of irrelevance, but we can also, I think, experience the suffering of embarrassment for being a Christian in our day and age and what people think of that. Let me give you a little example of this. When I was looking for seminaries, one of the seminaries that I was exploring was Yale Divinity School. And when I went out to Yale, I contacted a professor there ahead of time. His name is Miroslav Volf. He's a Serbian theologian. He's very well known. He had just moved from one seminary that was known for being kind of a haven for intellectual evangelicals and was newly hired at Yale. And I wanted to meet with him because at that time I had grown up in the evangelical church. I had gone to Wheaton College, which was like a flagship evangelical school. Going to Yale was like a big jump for me. It was like one of my friends said, "Oh, you're going to go study with the enemies." And that's not what I think right now, but there was this sort of sense in the circles that I grew up in that that's what I was doing. So I had heard that Miroslav Volf was friendly to evangelicals and was an evangelical himself. And I asked if we could meet to talk, and we met. It's like, this is stunning to me. I mean, this is like a world-class theologian who is willing to meet with me for coffee, and I think we even had lunch. And I just talked to him about my sort of fears about that, and I introduced it saying, like, I've heard that you're evangelical. And he said to me, it depends on what kind of evangelical you're talking about. Like the evangelicals from the school that I went to, or the evangelicals from this other seminary or school that he named at that point. He's like, if you're talking about them, no, I'm not an evangelical. But if you're talking about this group over here, yes, I am an evangelical. And I think that we all have that kind of experience at times when people hear or learn that we are a Christian. And you may not call yourself an evangelical. And this was all before Trump and all before like the way that like the word evangelical has gotten politicized lately over the last 8 years or so. But you may have experienced again the same thing with just the word Christian or follower of Jesus. Oh, and of course the Christians that people know about are the wacko Christians. They're like the embarrassing uncle at Thanksgiving kind of Christians. And so you experience that sort of embarrassment. I'm okay, if you're talking about Christians like this, or you're talking about Christians like this, which one are you talking about? Not like this. Yes, I'll claim this. I had this experience recently reading a news report about this gathering of Christians called Amerifest 2023. And maybe you heard about this in the news as well. As in December. And the keynote speaker for this event was Steve Bannon. And it makes my skin crawl thinking that there's a group of Christians who thought that a good speaker for politics from a Christian perspective is Steve Bannon. And Steve Bannon in his keynote speech, you know, just like Donald Trump used all kinds of derogatory words towards other people, called Mike Pence Judas Pence. He referred to Nikki Haley as a viper or as ambitious as Lucifer, essentially calling her Satan or evil. And the crowd started to chant, F her, but they didn't just say the word F, they used the whole word. And so he started to repeat it from the well, from the stage. All of this was followed with worship music. And I think, I don't want to be associated. That is beyond embarrassing to me. Like, embarrassment is probably not strong enough word, that I consider myself something that's other people like think that that's how it works. And the article that I read this in was from the Rolling Stones. And when they published the article originally, they contacted Rolling Stones to make a correction. They wanted Rolling Stones and their readers to know that the audience wasn't saying F her, they were saying Tucker, as in Carlson Tucker for vice president with Trump. And I thought of all of the things that you wanted to clarify and make sure that there wasn't any confusion about, you wanted to just make sure that the readers knew there wasn't any profanity being spoken. This whole thing reminds me of an infamous chapel speech at Wheaton College. That I told you that's where I went to school, where Tony Campolo was there, and he made the comment that like 30,000 kids died of malnutrition over the night, and you all don't give a shit. And the worst part about it is that you care more that I said shit in Wheaton College Chapel than that 30,000 kids died in the last however many time it was. I find myself saying, which kind of Christian am I? I'm a Tony Campolo. Yes, a Tony Campolo kind of Christian. A Marifest Christian, oh, that really, embarrassment is too light of a word. But here's what I want you to know. If you're like me, where you're like, yes, Tony Campolo is my kind of Christian and no Marifest, don't let the Christians that embarrass you keep you from proclaiming the good news of Jesus. Don't let the Christians that embarrass you keep you from claiming the good news of Jesus. Choose to suffer that embarrassment for the sake of Jesus, for the sake of the gospel. Don't give in to that shame. Paul, the first missionary of the church, the author of many of the books of the Bible, put it this way: "For I am not ashamed of this good news about Jesus Christ. It is the power of God at work, saving everyone who believes, the Jew first and also the Gentile." And here's what that good news is. The Son of God became a human so that humans might become sons and daughters of God. That the character of God took on flesh in Jesus so that flesh might take on the character of God. That is love. The good news is that we are forgiven, that we are set free, that we are healed. That in Jesus' life, his death, his resurrection, we are forgiven of our guilt. We are forgiven of our sin. We are set free from the bondage of sin and death and brokenness. And we are healed from the disease and the wounds of this sinful world. And that is not something irrelevant or something to be embarrassed about, because other Christians get that wrong and wrap it all up in nationalism. It might be hard to answer this question in 90 seconds, and let me tell you, that's okay. These chat questions, by the way, are always just an invitation to keep talking out in the cafe afterwards, or at home around lunch with your friends or family, or in the comments section. But here's another question for discussion. Where might you be called to suffer for the good news of Jesus? All right, so we're into this really paradoxical statement that we are called to suffer. And the first way that we're called to suffer is for the sake of the gospel. But the second way that we are called to suffer is we are called to suffer for the sake of justice. The author of Leviticus says, "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against a fellow Israelite, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." Have you heard that before? Love your neighbor as yourself? You should have, because Jesus says that it's the second greatest commandment. The first greatest commandment is love God with everything you got. And the second greatest commandment, Jesus actually quoting from the Bible of his day, which is Leviticus. And I wanted to quote from Leviticus just to throw you all off of it, because everybody loves to hate the book of Leviticus. But it was an inspiration for Jesus to love your neighbor as yourself. And sometimes that has to do with suffering for the cause, for the sake of justice. There are resistors to injustice in every day and age, and Of course, one of the biggest moments of that for us in the history of America was the civil rights movement of the 60s. And when you think about the resistors of that day, you think about John Lewis or Fannie Lou Hamer. But one person you may not know about, because I certainly didn't know about her until I read John Perkins' book, is Viola Liuzzu. Now, Viola was a middle-class suburban wife in Detroit, and when she saw on the news marchers getting attacked by police and, dogs, she said, I can't let my people be treated like this. Now, it's interesting that she said, I can't let my people, because remember, she's a white, middle-class suburban mom in Detroit. So she ended up driving down, and her husband told her, like, listen, this is not your fight. And she said, it's everybody's fight. It's everybody's issue. So she ended up driving down to the South, and in transporting weary marchers in one protest, a group of Klansmen shot her twice in the head. She became the first white woman to die in the civil rights movement. She suffered for the cause of justice. Maybe she was willing to do this because her closest friend was a black woman, and before she left to drive down south, she went over to her friend's house and said, if anything happens to me, take care of my kids. Take care of my kids. And after she was executed by these Klansmen, the family got death threats. They had crosses burned in their yard, and they continued to suffer for the cause of justice. Now, my own cultural background and temperament always in these situations lead me to say, hold on, let's calm down, everybody. Calm down. Let's not get too worked up. Let's not let our emotions get too out of control here, okay? And protesting hasn't been something that I learned or saw Christians doing or was modeled for me, or really even like pastors being involved in justice in the churches that I grew up in. And so this is something that I've had to learn. And in many ways, I've learned it by following black leaders here in the Lansing area, particularly my friend, Pastor Sean Holland. But before I had ever met Sean, after Ferguson and everything that happened there, I decided I needed to get involved. And I went to a protest at the city hall that was led by Black Lives Matter. And the leaders of Black Lives Matter at that time were three well-known Christians in the Lansing area. And one of them was Pastor Melvin Jones, who is the pastor, or he was the pastor at Union Missionary Baptist Church, the big Baptist church on the south side, right? Like MLK splits. It's like it's splitting the sea of MLK, like Moses there. And I went up to Melvin Jones, Pastor Melvin, and I had met him before, but I figured he probably wouldn't have recognized me. So I reintroduced myself. And I was feeling really nervous about the whole thing. I think it was the first protest I ever participated in. And I really just wanted to sit in the back and observe and watch. But I made the mistake of reintroducing myself to Pastor Melvin, because when the whole thing was done and concluding and wrapping up, he invited me, Pastor Tom Arthur, to come up to the stage and to pray in front of all these protesters, in front of Mayor Verge Bonero, in front of Police Chief Mike Yankowski, to stand up on that stage and pray for the sake of justice. I got all twisted, I got all knotted up. Of course, I stood up and I prayed, and I got over myself. I don't remember what I prayed, but I stood on the stage. And it wasn't much, but it was the first step. And that first step for me have led to being involved in all kinds of other things. In 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, participating in the statewide Black Lives Matter protest at the Capitol. And then again at City Council, where we kneeled for 9.5 minutes. Have you ever just knelt like Derek Chauvin knelt on George Floyd's neck for 9.5? It's a long time. It's a long time. And one thing that was really sad to me that day as city council city hall protest, so I was the only white clergy there. Now, since then, I've gotten more comfortable with this form of, I don't know, like protesting, suffering, putting yourself out there, getting out of your comfort zone for the sake or for the cause of justice, to the point that when Patrick Lyoya was executed in Grand Rapids, shot in the back of the head while he was on the ground, and there was a march and a protest downtown Lansing, I took my kids out of school and we joined that march. We biked down to the Capitol. My kids are getting a different experience. They were right in their element. They loved the chanting. What do we want? Justice. When do we want it? Now. Say his name, Patrick Lyoya. I was more and more in my comfort zone. But it's my hope that I was teaching them something about, well, it's not going to be suffering for them. It's just going to be what we do as Christians. Recently, I've been participating with the Lansing People's Assembly as it engages the Lansing School District. And while that's a challenging place to be in, I stood up at a local Board of Education meeting and I spoke about the need for some changes. And if you watch that video, you'll see somebody who looks all calm and collected on the outside, but on the inside, I'm all nervous and anxious. And I'm getting into a space that's out of my comfort zone. So here's another chat question for you. Where are you called to suffer for the cause of justice? Let's talk about that. So when we started this, I made the claim, or John Perkins makes the claim, that we are called to suffering. And that may have seemed like a crazy idea, but I hope you're starting to get the basic idea here, is that we are called to suffer for the sake of the gospel. We are called to suffer for the cause of justice. But the third way that we are called to suffer is we are called to suffer with those who suffer. C.S. Lewis, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, was a great defender of the Christian faith in his day and age. And one of the books of defense that he wrote was called The Problem of Pain. It was like his way of thinking intellectually about how do we understand a good God and yet there's still suffering in the world. And here's one of the things he said in that book. Suffering is not good in itself. What is good in any painful experience is, for the sufferer, his submission to the will of God, and for the spectators, the compassion aroused and the acts of mercy to which it leads. Later in life, with the death of his wife, Joy, Lewis began to question the first half of that there's something good in sort of God's megaphone of pain in the midst of suffering. But he never let go of the second part of that there is a good in suffering that causes people to respond in acts of compassion to those who are suffering. And Lewis lived this out himself his whole life. For example, in World War I, he was in the trenches, and his, fellow soldier, and he made a pact. They said, like, if one of them lives and the other dies, that they would each take care of the other's mother. And Lewis's, fellow soldier died, and Lewis took care of his mother. She actually lived with him until she died. And from all accounts, she was a pretty wretched person to live with, not easy to live with. During World War II, Lewis, who was a bachelor almost his entire life, I mean, you got to think about this guy. He's like an Oxford Don, an Oxford professor, very academic, very bookish. And even though he wrote books for children that children love and adults love as well, he actually didn't like the company of children very much. But during World War II, he had several kids who lived with him to get away from the big cities. that were being bombed. And one of those children had a mental disability, and Lewis painstakingly taught him how to read, to suffer with those who suffer. We know this story, actually. This is kind of a little bit of, trivia from history. We know this story because Sigmund Freud's granddaughter-in-law, Jill, was one of those children that stayed with C.S. Lewis during World War II. And she tells the story of Lewis teaching this young boy to read. One of the places that I have been called to suffer with those who suffer the greatest was from my friends who had a son who died the day after Christmas. There's a friend of mine from college who happened to also be in Durham while I was at seminary at Duke, and we met weekly during that time. He was a friend of mine who was a backpacking companion. We backpacked together all over the United States, the Adirondacks, the Smoky Mountains, Yosemite, and he had a son who was about the age of my son Micah, and on the day after Christmas many years ago, there was a construction truck whose brake gave out and rolled down the hill and smashed into his son, killing him right in front of his own house. This is what happens when you are a pastor and your friends go through situations like this, is you become a pastor to your friends. And my friend asked me to come down to Durham and to lead this funeral. It's by far the hardest funeral I've ever led. And it led me to ask a lot of questions about God and suffering and the struggle. But in those moments, whether it's a huge suffering like that or the smaller sufferings like the loss of a job or life not turning out quite the way that you expect, as followers of Jesus, we are called to suffer with those who suffer. Paul, in his first letter to the church at Corinth, says this: "He comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort others. When they are troubled, we will be able to give them the same comfort God has given us." So here's a final question to talk about. Where are you called to suffer with those who suffer?